Okay, now I'm here. As Christy said, those of you who have been my students know that since I do know who you are, I can call on you at any time, and I plan on doing so during this talk. So be paying attention and be ready. Just joking. The kind of overarching theme of the talk is uncertainty. But if you think about it for a second, planning is all about uncertainty because planning is a future-oriented activity. I think if the last 5 years has taught us anything, the future is very unlikely to be what we have seen in the past. It's very likely to be something different. And so that increases our level of uncertainty and increases our anxiety about a number of different things. One of the techniques that was developed to try to deal with this inherent uncertainty in planning is called scenario analysis or scenario planning. And the definition here is a scenario is an inherently consistent view of what the future might turn out to be, not a forecast, but one possible future outcome. And hence a scenario planning process uses multiple scenarios incorporating a range of possible futures that, on the one hand, define the outer bounds of impacts from external factors, and by doing so, provide some sort of bounding or frame of reference for containing that level of uncertainty. Let me illustrate. Peter Schwartz was a strategic planner working for Shell Oil. Now, I don't know if this is exactly a true story, but this is what I've been told, is that when he started, he had a little cubicle down in the basement, and he had a hard time getting the senior executives in the company to pay any attention to him, and he started to convene middle-level management to talk about what he had learned about scenario analysis, and to suggest that maybe Shell should be looking at multiple possible futures, especially for those economic and geopolitical circumstances that the company didn't control, and to think about it in those multitude of different ways. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, he came up with a series of scenarios. One of the scenarios that he came up with effectively anticipated the 1973 Arab-Israeli conflict and the resulting Arab oil embargo that followed that. Shell was the only oil company that had anticipated that outcome, and as a result benefited remarkably by being able to be nimble, light on its feet, being able to be prepared for that possible outcome, and to implement a completely different investment and business strategy. Mr. Schwartz got a better office after that. Transportation planning agencies, especially at the metropolitan level, kind of incorporated or glommed on to this idea of multiple possible futures, alternative possible futures, and used it as a basis for doing transportation planning in their respective regions. And they took elements from the military business scenario planning practice, and they melded it with some other existing planning practices that they were already familiar with, and they created this new kind of hybrid land use transportation scenario analysis, incorporating variable land use assumptions, but not broader economic and environmental considerations, and that is the kind of the focal point that I want to zoom in on tonight. So this is the way the typical system works. You have a series of inputs into the planning process. Some of them are variable, meaning that they're different stories, different assumptions in the inputs. Not all of them are, however. So because, again, a lot of these processes are being done by transportation agencies, transportation system elements vary from scenario to scenario to scenario. So if you go from A to B to C to D, the last one was called preferred. One of them may be more focused on highways, another one may be more focused on transit, a third one might be more focused on arterials. But the idea is to test different policy inputs, in this case investment inputs, and to see how they work. And then the second item here is land use and growth allocations. Where is the development going to go in the future? Are we going to consume as much land as we have in the past, or are we going to create this more compact, pedestrian-friendly, transit-friendly future? And again, going down that list of scenario A, B, C, D, E, the scenarios vary that. So in this scenario, let's, business as usual, let's consume as much land as we've been doing the last 20 years. Okay, fine. The next scenario, let's be a little bit more compact. The next scenario, a little bit more mixed use, etc. In some scenario planning processes, there's even a change in the assumptions about how much growth is coming. How many people really will move into our region? How many jobs will move into our region? This is politically volatile. And there are not many places that do this because of that. Because, it's those projections that usually come out of the governor's office, and at least in our case, from the governor's office of planning and budget, that project in a single forecast way, I might add, how many people, how many households, how many jobs are coming to each county. Those are sacrosanct. And changing those or suggesting that you're going to alter those or call into question those numbers is politically fraught. Okay, so that's what the inputs are. They go into a box, a black box, a series of models that are mathematically derived and run by very powerful computers, and they kick out measures, assessments of the different scenarios according to what we tell the models to tell us. A lot of them are the outputs are travel related. There is usually some observation on air quality. In some cases, greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide are also measured. Increasingly, public costs are really becoming a focus. Public expenditures for infrastructure, for roads, for sewers, for schools, etc. That is becoming an increasingly popular measure for these. You show people the natural, logical result of their communities planned 20, 30, 40 years in the future based on what they've been doing, and people say, I don't want that. People look at it and they just say, it's just kind of ugly. That's not who we want to be. And so what they ask is, please give us some sort of alternative. Show us how we can be different. And almost invariably, they come up with a series of scenarios, a series of stories about the future that are what? More compact, less land consumptive, more transit-friendly, more pedestrian-oriented, more community-based. The map here shows all the different regions in the country that have undertaken this kind of analysis. It's not just something they're doing here in Oregon. It's not just a bunch of lefties out there who are trying to play around with the regulatory system. There is a general concern nationwide about livability and sustainability and what the future might bring. And a sense that what we've been doing so far is not going to work for the long haul. We need to come up with a different story, a better story. Of course, the future may not be exactly like the present, like we've talked about, and that's one of the limitations of these models, is the models are projecting into the future assumptions based on the present or the past. So the outputs, again, a focus on transportation, and we see this is vehicle miles traveled. That's the composite measure of the amount that people are driving. And you see that most of these, not all, but most of these scenarios are showing a less auto-oriented future. Air quality is an important measure, as I mentioned. Greenhouse gas emissions is important in some regions. I suspect that all of these are from California, because California said that told its planning agencies to pay attention to these issues. But this is something that I mentioned before. The new focus on public expenditures. When planning and growth management, the growth management focus in planning got started in the 1970s, the focus was really about how to do more with less. Local governments were looking and scrambling for ways that they could still provide public facilities and services with a stagnant or maybe shrinking a base of revenues. And so that was what was driving growth management. There was not that much concern about environmental issues per se, open space protection, farmland protection. Those were not first on their agenda. In the 1980s, in the 1990s, those became very important issues and were really driving the push towards growth management, or what we would now call smart growth and related planning styles and topics. But we're seeing now in this time of austerity and kind of Tea Party politics a kind of a return in focus to that infrastructure efficiency motivation. Local governments, once again, like the 1970s, are having to do more with less. They're faced with shrinking budgets for a variety of reasons, and they're asking themselves pretty much the same questions that we were asking ourselves back in the 1970s, which is how can we provide facilities and services and infrastructure with stagnant or shrinking budgets? And so what I'm going to suggest here is that it's time to take the next step. That in addition to making alternative stories about the future that change our ideas about how we invest in transportation, that change our ideas about how we plan for and zone development of land, we also need to be looking at those things that we really don't control but really have a huge impact on our lives and our communities. And those tend to be sourced in economics. And I'm going to focus here on peak oil and energy prices as an example of this broader topic, but I want you to understand it's just an example because there are many other things in kind of the economic sphere that can and do influence how the future unfolds in our communities. This funny looking guy is M. King Hubbert, who was a geologist working for Shell Oil again. There they are. In the 1950s, he presented a paper in 1954 that was actually not about peak oil. It was actually about nuclear power. He was talking about the future of nuclear power, and to demonstrate the importance of moving to a more nuclear future, he talked about something that became known as peak oil. And his idea was this. There's a kind of an upward curve in the rate at which that oil well will produce oil. Obviously, before you start, there's none, right? But you find the reserve, you haul the equipment on site, you drill the hole into the ground, and you start to get some oil coming out. And over time, it builds up, and it continues to build up until this point here. At a certain point, it stops increasing. It doesn't decrease yet. It's not like it's run dry by any means. But it's just the rate of increase has slowed down and then eventually plateaued and stopped. And then, of course, it starts to taper off. And this is just a reflection of the fact that there's only so much underneath that particular hole. There's only so much pressure to push it out of the ground easily. And once that pressure has been relieved to a certain extent and the volume has been reduced to a certain extent, there's still more to get. You just have to work harder to get it. And that's where we go to the downhill slope of the curve. And of course, when it becomes more difficult to get, it becomes more expensive to get. This phenomenon, Hubbert discovered, works not only at the well level, but it works at the field level also. And so what we're seeing here is, this is empiric data. We're seeing the production curves for individual fields. Actually, these are all offshore. They're in the Gulf Coast. And so he looked at these two things. He said, well, this is how production works, the economics of production work at the well level, and this is how it works at the field level. And he's, in this paper in 1954, said, I think this will happen also at the national level. And he could predict that and project that oil production level in the lower 48 states would at some point reach that plateau, reach that point at which it was no longer easy and hence economical to be increasing the rates of production, and at that point it might tip and start to go down. And that date, he said, would be 1970. And boy, was he spot on. Production in the lower 48 states peaked in 1970. This early production, peak rather, is in the amount of oil reserves, the discovery of oil reserves. And that was another part of his theory, is that there would be a peak first in the amount of oil discovered. And then later there would be a peak in production. So the question then becomes, will this happen? Since it happened at the well level, it happened at the field level, and it happened at the national level, will this happen at the global level? Here is a projection of when it and how it might happen at the global scale. And when I came across this just yesterday, and I came across it, I was kind of shocked. First of all, it's predicting, and here these are different locations of oil-producing regions in the world. You can see, again, U.S. lower 48, 1970, the peak we just saw there. And you can see the overall peak is right about now. And I thought, you know, if I had been shown this graph without any sort of attribution, if I didn't see where it had come from, I would have thought, oh, this is from, you know, NRDC or the Sierra Club or one of those kind of fuzzy environmental groups. This is from the World Energy Council. And I don't know if you know who those folks are, but this is one of the most conservative organizations looking at oil and oil supply that there is. These are the oil ministers from all the oil-producing states. These are the chief operating officers from all the major oil companies. This is a pretty conservative group. And this is what they put out in their 2007 projection, was that peak oil at a global scale would happen right about now. This is from a study that was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy. It's a different kind of scenario analysis where there are variations in growth in demand, variations in the amount of oil reserves, which we really don't know because a lot of that information is closely guarded secrets by nation states and by corporations. And the place I want to point you to is this column here, which shows you, again, a wide range of different years when peak oil might hit. But not all of them are that far off. And the point that I want to emphasize here is that some of these dates, and quite a number of these dates, are within the planning horizons that our transportation planning agencies are planning for right now. I mean, our current transportation plan, land use transportation plan for our region has a horizon year of 2040. Well, how many dates here do we have that are within that horizon? So this is an issue that is really calling on our profession to pay attention to it. Here is a national study showing price elasticity, which is a fancy way of saying how much response in transit ridership did people exhibit during 2007-2008 to the increase in gasoline prices. And the bigger the circle, the bigger the effect. So people in Cheyenne, man, did they change their habits big time. Salt Lake City, yeah, not so much. It's not just about riding transit more. It's also making sensible decisions about where you live and how you live, using fourth quarter 2006 as the starting point and comparing it to fourth quarter, 1 year later, fourth quarter 2007. What we're seeing is that houses located closer to downtown were appreciating. They cost more a year later, while houses further from downtown were depreciating. They cost less. Why? Well, changes in demand. And this is what you would expect. When there's higher demand for a product, the price goes up. When there's less demand, it goes down. So we would expect that these houses, there were more buyers or potential buyers chasing after these more centrally located houses during this 12-month period, and that there were fewer chasing after these less centrally located houses. It suggests that people were responding in part to that change in gasoline prices. So this is where I think the practice is starting to go and really needs to go. Here are the things that we know. We know that scenario analysis in general is an effective method for thinking about alternative futures, thinking about the future in alternative ways, especially when there's significant uncertainty. We now know that, as I said before, regional planning agencies, transportation planning agencies are well practiced with the technique, but only with respect to those kind of traditional variables. I call them internal variables, but those are traditional variables that they usually deal with. Transportation investments, land development patterns based on zoning and planning. We know that energy prices are likely to be much more volatile in the future than they've been in the past. That volatility usually translates as being more expensive. I mean, there's likely to be wild swings up and down, but the trend is likely to be significantly more expensive. That, of course, increases uncertainty. And based on all of those things, I conclude that it's time to start incorporating those kinds of uncertainties into our planning practices and to start to make decisions about the future based on the real possibility that it's not going to be like the past. Thank you very much.